I okay. Okie doke. Well, welcome to our members and our members only treading and discussion of George Washington, uh, entrepreneur, innovative farmer. Um, my name is Sam Murphy. I am the manager of Historic Trades. We are the costumed interpreters that are able to interpret 18th century events and put them in a 21st century perspective. Unlike character interpreters that are living in the late 18th century, we are here to make the connections for people of the way life was in the 18th century, but to be able to make it understandable by our visitors. We, as a department, man the blacksmith shop, the grist mill and distillery. Our team is also responsible for making the whiskey and brandies that we have here at Mount Vernon. And we also run the demonstration farm down on the Potomac. It is here where we're going to be really focusing our discussions today about Washington's role as a farmer, an inventor, an innovator, and then be able to look at one of the most interesting things, I think, here at the estate, and that is our reconstruction of his 16-sided treading barn. So thank you again for being here. And this is from a very personal level. I have been a member of Mount Vernon since 2004. And I'd like to thank all of you who are so generous in helping keep this very special place alive. So we couldn't do it without our members, especially with this past year. So from one member to another, thank you all so much for your continued support. So without further ado, let's get started.
Welcome to this virtual presentation on Washington, the entrepreneur, inventor, and farmer. My name's Sam Murphy. I am the manager of Historic Trades here at George Washington's Mount Vernon. Using the Potomac as our backdrop, we're going to look at how Washington, for all the things we learned about him in school, his real love, his passion is farming. His income is tied to how well this farming enterprise operates. For those who haven't been here for a while, just a real quick refresher. Washington moves from tobacco to wheat as his cash crop in the mid-1760s. Washington was going into debt. Being a tobacco planter was not as lucrative as it had once been for the previous generations of Washingtons. So Washington's inheriting this 2,100 acre tobacco plantation. The British are requiring us to send our tobacco to England to be taken to market, auctioned, and then the proceeds for the sale of that tobacco doesn't come back to Mount Vernon. It is credit issued for the purchase of British trade goods sold in British shops. Now here's the big challenge. Washington is competing with tobacco planters all up and down the eastern seaboard. Tobacco is brutal on the soil. So generations of tobacco planting have pretty much so depleted the nutrients, which means you're seeing declining yields. Washington sends his tobacco over, sends a shopping list. His representative, his factor, takes it to market, sells it, and then faithfully purchases all the items on the shopping list. Crates it all up, puts it back on a British ship, arriving at Mount Vernon. Now imagine Washington's surprise as they're uncrating all of these trade goods, all these things they've ordered, much of it of suspect quality. Not only to find what they've ordered, but to find a bill. Washington hasn't sent over enough tobacco at market prices to cover the cost of the goods he's ordered. His factor says, that's okay, I know you're good for it. So instead of sending me the shortage of payment now for the goods you've already received, I'll just wait and take that out of next year's harvest with interest. Well, that's compounding debt. That's a credit card you're never going to pay off. And no surprise, Washington doesn't want to embrace debt as the basis of a successful business model. But he needs a replacement for that tobacco, and he chooses wheat. Now, here's the loophole. Tobacco is treated to all those restrictions. Wheat is not. Within 5 years of making the conversion from tobacco to wheat, Washington's out of debt. His wheat harvest has increased 24-fold, and now Washington starts buying up neighboring farms. That 2,100 acres he inherits will grow to 8,000 acres. Now, one of the biggest challenges Washington faces is you've got all this depleted soil. What can you do to re-nourish the soil? Well, one, taking tobacco out of the mix helps. But Washington will embrace what was considered a very cutting-edge farming technique of the day called crop rotation. He's setting it up in this 7-year, 7-field system so that you're able to get nutrients back into the soil using a combination of animal matter, fertilizer, and plant matter, which we know today as nitrogen fixers, things like clover, cowpeas, buckwheat, turnips, things that you grow, plow back in the soil gets healthier. With wheat as his new cash crop, he still has to feed everybody here, so the largest staple crop was corn. Then cereal grains, rye, oats, barley. Rye and barley become particularly important later in life when Washington builds a distillery. He also is using sheep to graze the pasture grass. They're pulling up the plants by the roots. The manure they leave behind doesn't need composting. The wool is used to be processed for winter weight clothing here at the estate. Washington, by having now this new cash crop, he's processing the wheat, taking it to his grist mill, milling it into a superior grade of flour called superfine. It's almost like pastry grade flour by today's standards. People are willing to pay top dollar to have white bread on their dinner table. So Washington is more than happy to give the market what it wants. His target markets are in Southern Europe, Italy, Spain, Portugal. Now Portugal is particularly important because Washington needs salt to salt pack the fish he's pulling out of the Potomac every early spring. The very best salt in the world for salt packing meats, vis-a-vis the fish, is Lisbon salt. So Washington's sending flour to Portugal, salt comes back, uses the salt to salt pack the 1.5 million fish coming out of the Potomac every year, sells those fish to the sugarcane plantations in the West Indies. He'd tell you that's good business. They still call that vertical integration of business models today. So Washington was really focused not only on agriculture and the success of his own farming enterprise, but Washington starts to take a very paternalistic approach to farming. 9 out of 10 of us were farmers at the time. If you're a smallholder, you're a small family farmer, you're living out in the Ohio Valley, you've got 200, 300 acres. If you try something new and it fails, you lose your farm, your family starves. So Washington will dedicate acres of farmland to do strain studies, density studies, fertilization studies. 60 different crops experimented here, all with the understanding that he can take a risk. If he tries something and it fails, no big deal. But his goal is to help advance agriculture for the nation. In his last address to Congress, Washington suggests that we as a nation needed a federally focused clearinghouse on agricultural science. Today we know it as the USDA. Now, Washington's vision for having that government agency doesn't come to fruition until Lincoln signs the Organic Act in 1862. But down here, we talk about Washington as truly the visionary farmer and the one whose contributions really advanced agriculture for our new republic. We're going to be heading up here to look at our treading barn, and you're going to have your own private virtual treading here. So we'll see you in a bit. Well, welcome to our 16-sided treading barn. We consider this the crown jewel of our demonstration farm. And this reconstruction is a working barn. We're going to show you how wheat is processed in the 18th century. Washington is a farmer first and foremost. He is going to switch from tobacco to wheat as his cash crop in the mid-17th century, starting to buying up neighboring farms. So the 2,100 acres that Washington inherits will grow to 8,000 acres. Utilizing very cutting-edge farming techniques of the day called crop rotation, Washington introduces science into the business of agriculture. With wheat as his new cash crop, he's faced with a challenge wheat farmers have always faced, and that is, how do you separate the seeds from the top of the stalk? We need those seeds to make our flour. Well, the methods available at the time, and these are all still practiced around the world today, is flailing and treading. Now, flailing, using this tool called a flail. It is a stick tied to another stick. It's kind of like nunchucks on steroids. You lay the wheat on the ground and you start wailing on it. And the goal is to knock the seed from the top of the stalk. It's effective, it's not terribly efficient. A more efficient method, dating at least back to the ancient Egyptians, you'd lay wheat in a circular pattern in the barnyard. You'd stand in the middle, you put a horse on a lead, and have that horse trot around or tread out that seed. Now, there happened to have been a very famous Revolutionary War expression where the word tread figures prominently. Perhaps you've seen it on a license plate, a bumper sticker, a t-shirt today. Don't tread on me. And it's a method of processing wheat far superior to beating it with a stick. But both methods share common problems. Once you've knocked that seed from the top of the stalk, you have to gather up all that straw, shake out the seed, and set about recovering those wheat seed from the barnyard. New challenge. Washington's processing his wheat late June, early July, and through the summer months. And as any of us who live here in Northern Virginia know, we get fast-moving thunderstorms here. If you're out processing wheat and it starts to rain, everything you've been working on is lost. Take it straight to the compost pile. So Washington's in Philadelphia as sitting president when he puts pen to paper and comes up with this design. He's going to incorporate the very best methods of processing, horsepower, but he moves the entire operation indoors and undercover. He's eliminated the elements from the equation. The barnyard is replaced with 1.5-inch gap flooring, so you lay about an acre's worth of wheat, that's about 18 to 20 inches deep, across the treading floor, bring a team of horses up the ramp. Once inside, they're immediately put into a trot and kept in a trot for about 45 minutes. Over that 45-minute period, the horses' hooves will knock 90% of the seed from the top of the stalk, leaving 90% of the straw behind. After the horses have finished their processing, out they come, get in, you start tossing the spent straw out the windows. In the center is an area where you can store about 5 to 6 acres of harvested wheat. During the course of the day, you're processing 6 to 7 acres in what Washington calls his unbreakable machine. So we're going to bring the horses up here and you're going to get your own virtual treading.
So as our colleagues from livestock are bringing in the horses. There are, one of the questions we're often asked is how many horses are participating in these trainings? How many people are involved? Records indicate 3 to 6 horses. If you allow for a little bit of conjecture between the livestock and our department, we think they may have been alternating 2 teams of 3. You can train horses to run in harness. You take them out of harness and they'll continue to run as they're still in harness. That would give you 2 horses in a lead position. The trailing horse is not going to stay in the same spot. So they go out, they move in, they go out, they move in. Over the course of 45 minutes, as the horses trot around, they're knocking 90% of the seed from the top of the stalk. That seed is falling down through gaps in the floorboards, leaving 90% of the straw behind. On the lower level, you're actually looking up at the gapping. You're actually seeing some of the wheat as it rains down upon us. Washington goes through 4 gappings to determine that 1.5 inches was the ideal. At 1/2 inch and 1 inch gapping, the wheat straw was getting jammed up between those gaps and nothing was falling through. At a 2 inch gap, it was allowing too much unprocessed wheat to fall through. So they settle in on 1.5 inch gapping for that treading floor. Now, Washington had hoped to have had one of these per working farm. That would have been one at each of the farms making up his 8,000 acres. There were 30,820 bricks in the foundation, over 19,000 nails, over 100,000 feet of milled lumber. It really was an incredible feat to build this. And Washington's faced with the challenge, do I build more? We're at the cusp of the Industrial Revolution, and new machines, threshers, are starting to make their way to market.
I'd like to give a special shout out to our livestock team. Manager Lisa Pregent back with Troy, Megan Bannon up here with Madge, who have come down so that you could have your own private virtual treading barn experience. So thank you both for coming and helping out with this.
So as just to continue on the thought process of building this treading barn, Washington, even before he came up with that idea, had seen these new threshers, had dismissed them as too complicated, prone to breakage, too expensive. He builds the one treading barn over at Dogrun Farm, would have been on the opposite side of Route 1 and Route 235. And he's left with the challenge, do I build more? He goes out because about 5 years have elapsed from the time he had seen the first thresher to when he takes another look, seeing that the early design flaws have been corrected. The price has dropped substantially. In a letter to his farm manager, Washington writes, I shall begrudge no reasonable expense for the neatness of my farms and orders 2 of these new machines, these new threshers, to be built. But he always called it his unbreakable machine. We hope that over the summer, you have an opportunity to come and witness a treading here live. We do them Saturdays and Sundays at 11, 1, and 3, weather permitting. So we do hope that you will make your way here and come talk to us. We'd love to see you. So, how old is the barn? Great question. It was built in the mid-1990s, and at the risk of suffering rotator cuff damage from patting ourselves on the back, no 20th century tools were used in its construction. It was 2 years of wood curing. It took a solid year at a pit saw. Bricks were made, nails hand wrought, all the hardware hand wrought. And it really is an amazing example of craftsmanship, done the exact same way it was built when it originally was built at Mount Vernon back in the 1790s. Where does the wheat come from? That's actually, we only have this site, the Pioneer Farm, is about 4.5 acres. So what we do every year, we go down to Southern Maryland. There's an Amish farmer that we have been buying his wheat every summer. We send our interns down, we pick up the wheat, we bring it up here. We think General Washington would approve that we are continuing to support smallholder, small family farmers. So we go down, buy his wheat, bring it up here, and then do treadings. Great question. That really is a wonderful. Did other farmers ever use this barn as a template for their own treading barns? Only 2 of these barns have ever been built, to our knowledge. The original built over on Doe Run Farm, a little over, probably about 4 miles from here, and this faithfully reconstructed one we just demonstrated. It was Washington intentionally does not patent the design for this so that everybody could build it. But if you think about it from a perspective of labor and material, everything that went into building it was really outside the grasp of most. Now, this round barn design has been around for a long time, but it tends to be more of a feeding barn for cattle than it is for processing wheat. With the really fast advent of mechanized technology, the threshers that were starting to come to market in the late 1790s and into the early 1800s really will render this obsolete, but exceptionally efficient and effective. It really is a testament to there's a problem, and Washington needed to come up with a solution. And the solution, before the threshers had really been perfected, was coming up with this barn. We will be doing treadings Saturdays and Sundays into mid-October. And it's always a weather permitting event. So we do hope that you can come down during the fall or the rest of anytime between now and mid-October and see one of these. If you never have had the opportunity, it's pretty interesting. And it really is. It's one of my favorite spots to interpret. What kind of horses would have been used for this process? They tend to be more ponies. The ones that you saw, Madge, who was the lead horse, the very tan colored, is a halflinger. They originate in Austria. Troy was a Morgan. You're going to have horses that tend to be more on the smaller side, ponies. That is until Washington becomes the father of the American mule. It's a great story of Washington receiving a gift from the King of Spain of 2 Spanish jacks. And Washington, sadly, only one of the horses or the mules survived the trip from Spain to Boston, instructing that the royal gift, as he was named, to be brought to Mount Vernon at his own pace. When the royal gift arrives, he's sent out on a propagation tour. Washington is considered the father of the American mule. By the 1830s, there are over 2 million mules in the United States, and Washington was certainly there in the forefront. Mules are wonderful work animals. They're hardy. They eat less. They're really smart. And by the time we get to the end of Washington's life, whereas in 1785, there are 130 horses, in 1799, there are only 25 horses and 58 mules. So he has now exchanged out his equine workforce with horses to mules. So you want a horse that is able to attain a trot, which is just sort of a jog. And the larger draft horses are just really not well suited for this type of work. It was. The question is, how long would the treading process have taken? It was basically sun up to sundown, 6 days a week. Uh, we have a bit of conjecture on probably how they dress the barn. They're processing 6 to 7 acres per day. We believe we have nothing to support this, but just thinking about it from a process, we think that at the end of the day, when they have finished their last treading, they're going to refill the middle of the barn with the 5 to 6 acres of wheat to be processed the following day, lay an acre's worth of wheat on the treading track, shut and lock the doors. Washington, when it was being built, told his carpenter to affix a sturdy lock upon the door, as I do not want my wheat walking out upon 2 feet. You close up, you leave, you come in the summer because you're harvesting the wheat late June, early July. I calculated out one time, I think it was 100, I don't know, 86 days maybe of active treading to process 800 acres of wheat. You get in, you get a couple of treadings in before the temperatures here get absolutely brutal. You'll take a break really about 2 hour break in the mid-afternoon when it gets the hottest around here, and then resume at the end of the day. So they're able to do this all day, rain or shine. And that was the whole point of moving the operation inside, was that Washington was losing about 20% of his harvest to the seeds being driven into the ground. And you add in the fast moving thunderstorms, it really is a prescription for disaster. And you'll end up losing, quite a bit of the wheat of your harvest to the soil and any fast moving thunderstorm. So he's able to cut his losses in half. And for him, it really was all about efficiency. The more seed he has, the more flour he can mill, the more flour he mills, the more money he can make. And that's really sort of the way he was looking at it. Yes, great question. We had the plans. We had access to the plans that had been in the Library of Congress. We knew that it was 52 feet in diameter, 1.5 gaps on the floorboards, all the number of bricks and nails and hardware. What we didn't know was the pitch of the roof. We found a photograph taken of the barn before it was torn down in the mid-1870s. We run the photograph through a CAD program, and now, as I call it, we had our Paul Harvey moment. We knew the rest of the story. So that barn is as close to what Washington had designed and had built, almost down to the brick and to the nail. So, yep, we had the plans, and it helped us be able to recreate that barn here on our property. Sadly, the original was built, there's a housing development over there now. So we were able to rebuild it here so that people have an opportunity to see really Washington's innovation and his ability to find a solution to a problem. And that was how to process wheat efficiently. I love this one. How long did it take? It took them and us almost about the same amount of time, about 2.5 years. And that's actually in the construction. And for Washington, one of the bigger challenges was nobody had ever done this before. So why do you gap floorboards in a treading barn? And that's why they went through 4 gappings to determine that 1.5 inches was the ideal. It was an amazing construction, both then and now. We even had a brickyard here, had some of our early interns actually making bricks. And our blacksmith shop was not in existence when the barn was built. So much of what is in there from a hardware standpoint came from our good friends at Colonial Williamsburg. Treadings, we should have, I believe the last scheduled treading is mid-October. Mid-October. I'm sorry, I don't have the exact date. What other crops did Washington grow? Well, in this crop rotation, it is wheat as his cash crop. So 800 acres of the 3,200 under crop are in wheat. The largest staple crop is corn, but everybody is relying on corn, from the Washington dinner table all the way down through the hired workers and down through the enslaved population. Corn was a staple of the day. It was part of the rations for the enslaved population. He's also growing cereal grains, and these are the rye, the oats, the barley, not only to be used as feed, but again, the rye and barley, when he builds a distillery, become particularly important because those are two of the three grain ingredients you need to make whiskey. He's growing experimental crops. The clover, the cowpeas, buckwheat, turnips, they're grown so that about every 28 days, you're able to plow them back into the soil. And because they are nitrogen fixtures, they really do a wonderful job of getting nutrients back into the soil. And the soil here was in really bad shape. And for those of you who live in the area, you dig down 2 feet anywhere here in Northern Virginia, hit clay. So we really don't have great soil to begin with. So for Washington, being able to, from a scientific approach, it's really, there's an agricultural age of enlightenment taking place here. And Washington is reading everything he can get his hands on about agricultural science. We think the first book pamphlet that he buys was from a British agronomist named Jethro Tull, if that name rings a bell. It was called The Horse Hoeing Husbandry, and it talks about how to properly care for your fields to get the best yield. Washington's read about this crop rotation and takes what had been a 3 to 4 year crop rotation system and tweaks it for a 7-year, 7-field system. Now, the other things he's doing, 60 different crops experimented with here. And it's all within the different strains. So different strains of wheat, different strains of oats, all because Washington, like some of his forward-thinking contemporaries, believe it's incumbent of those of means to advance agriculture for everybody else. The people that think the same way Washington does, Washington can dedicate acres of farmland for these studies, all with the understanding he can take a risk. If it fails, no big deal. But if it's successful, then he wants to be able to make sure that that information is disseminated out to the nation at large, again, because 9 out of 10 of us were farmers. So he's looking to take the risk so everybody else can reap the rewards. Okay, he is following farming trends, but he is also going to grow crops based upon really what does well. And it gets down to, I think we're up to researching that Washington grew, I want to say 17 different strains of wheat. And I know that several strains of oats. And he's corresponding with people all over the world. Mid 1780s, Washington establishes a pen pal relationship with a guy named Arthur Young, who was the editor of the Annals of Agriculture, a publication coming out of London. And Young is sending Washington seeds and cuttings from as far away as China, suggestions for experiments. Washington's putting these things into play and then sending back the results. Young is trying to convince Washington, to publish these himself. And Washington, being too modest, suggested it should come from an expert. Well, Washington by this time, I think, was pretty much one of those experts, but he really was incredibly modest about it. So the wheat is still, he's growing wheat to make sure that he has enough to sell in commercial markets. And in 1 year, there were about 268,000 pounds of wheat product. That's flour all the way down to the ship stuff, which was used to make hardtack and sea biscuits. So he's also taking suggestions from his other farming contemporaries about their experience with different things. So there's a whole lot of writing back and forth about 18th century agriculture and the best and most expedient ways of advancing agriculture in the nation. He did. He did have a dairy, and during June is when we normally have our dairy month, where we make butter and cheese and ice cream. If you've been to any of our summer programming, like Summer Escape, we usually have an ice cream demo there because the Washingtons loved ice cream. But one of my favorite quotations is Washington writing to his farm manager, his last farm manager, James Anderson, and basically asking, why is it with over 100 dairy cattle am I compelled to buy butter for my family? Now, in my mind, the real reason is because you've got all these people coming to visit the Washingtons, and people don't come and visit, they come and visit and stay. So my thought is that a lot of the butter that he's having to replace is because he has so many people. I think the figure is 677 overnight stays here in Mount Vernon in a year. I just can't imagine having that many house guests all the time. Other inventions, he came up with something called a barrel seeder. And it was ingenious. The process of planting is you drill down, you're basically making a hole, you're putting seed in, and then you're covering it up. And then so you're going down this long line. And keep in mind, these fields, the smallest of his fields was 60 acres. They grow up to 120 acres, and that's each. So on each of his 4 working farms, you're looking at anywhere from 60 to 120 acres times 7. To put it in perspective, that's like an acre is the size of a professional soccer field. The FIFA sanctioned soccer field is about an acre. So now think of just one field, 60 contiguous soccer fields, and that's on the small end, all the way up to 120. So planting becomes a real chore because you're basically walking along, pushing a hole in the ground, putting a seed, going along. So he designs and creates this barrel seeder. He takes a barrel, burns holes into the barrel, has the ability to fill it with seed to be planted. It's on a frame like for a plow. It's horse drawn. And as you go along, the seed fall down these seeding tubes into the ground. So you've cultivated the soil, the seed falls in, and then it covers it back up. So it's incredibly efficient, and certainly way easier than planting all of those seeds by hand. And you're able to really control all of the seeds. So not very long. The problem is that Washington, well, he was Washington. He was an entrepreneur of the first order. His passion was farming. When Washington passes and Mount Vernon's passed on to his nephews, none of them have the same love of farming. They're not looking at it as their way to make a living. Bushrod Washington, his nephew, inherits a mansion house, which means he inherits the house. Well, Bushrod was an associate justice of the Supreme Court. He wasn't a farmer. He doesn't need this as farming. This is a great, beautiful summer home to have sitting up high on the banks of the Potomac. Lawrence Lewis, married to Nellie Custis, inherits much of what is Doe Run Farm. You know, they build over at, and I'm drawing a blank, Woodlawn Plantation is where they live. And then the other nephew who had not yet reached the age of maturity. The problem is that none of them have the same love and passion of farming that Washington did. By the mid 1840s, Doe Run Farm is being sold off by Lewis's son Lorenzo, and sells it to Quakers who want the land for timber. So, although there was all of this great farming enterprise during Washington's lifetime, when he passes, it pretty much so. Within a few years, it really has come to an end. So, how can we learn more about Washington the farmer? Well, there are a number of publications, or our website is really, it's pretty complete. You can find out just about anything you would like to know about Washington the farmer. And absent that, well, come visit. And we have incredibly gifted interpreters working for us in historic trades, who would be more than happy to share Washington's vision for agriculture. All right. Well, I think we may have come to the end of our time together. So, again, thank you so much for your continued support of this very, very special place. And we do hope that you will find your way here in the very, very near future. And with that, I'll turn this back over to Julie.